So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. This week as our guest, I'm absolutely delighted to have the Director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, Annie Fletcher, joining me. Annie, thank you so much for being here.
You are welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Very, very happily. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Thank you to everyone who is, I can see people clicking in now this evening, so thank you to everyone who's joining us. If you've got questions for Annie over the course of the evening, please do type them in, and as always, we will get through them as we go through the evening. But Annie, just to jump in and start the conversation, I wonder if you might kind of contextualize us and just kind of set us up for the evening. When we talk contemporary art and modern art, could you just explain what those terms mean?
That's a great question, and one I think that we often debate. In a very classic sense, one could talk about modern art if one really looks at art history as a very particular project. One could argue actually that modernity in its sense of the Enlightenment, etc., could have even started 400 to 500 years ago in relation to the kind of European project. But I think often modern art is understood as a kind of period. I mean, I may be slightly wrong, but certainly late 19th century, right up until about 1960s, mid 70s. Then there was a very vigorous and interesting, often architect-led process called postmodern art. And then we went into a moment, I suppose around the mid 90s, maybe a little bit earlier, where people started to think about things like contemporary art and the global contemporary. These, of course, can all be allied very firmly to big historical shifts. Certainly the idea of globality in relation to the fall of the wall and the end of communism and a sense of a united world was quite interesting. One could also say postmodernism was a very Western project. So there's lots of critiques of all of these kind of labels. So I think for us, I'm very interested in understanding what is Ireland's sense of its modern period. I don't think that's an answered question. And one of the things that I think is very exciting about coming here now is trying to think about that quite precisely. Is our modernity something that you could fold into a kind of similar idea of what happened in Britain or in the Northwestern Hemisphere? I don't think so. I think it's very particular, obviously, with our 100 years of independence. And even the idea of the contemporary, we've now been calling contemporary art contemporary for 30 years. So when does contemporary stop? And what does 90s contemporary look like in comparison to 2020s contemporary? So I'm afraid I just have more questions rather than answers, but I think they're...
You've muted yourself, I think, there.
I hope not. Is that okay?
Oh, no, you're back again. Sorry.
I think it is the job of the museum to be a history-making machine, but sometimes it's quite worrisome when we sediment these ideas about time and about movements. So I think the intellectual project is to kind of constantly think about what that might mean for us.
That term of a history-making machine is really interesting, because I know we would think about ourselves and kind of, what stories are appropriate for the Little Museum to be telling, and I've never heard it phrased exactly that way. And just to pick up on something that you mentioned there a minute ago, you spoke about different kind of movements and how the art of that time was largely informed by the architecture.
I would say specifically with postmodernism. I mean, there's various strands to it, but it was a very, very exciting moment of debunking, or there was a certain amount of deconstructing of the modernist project that seemed to happen. So Aldo Rossi and many of the kind of incredible architects who were, really questioning what all of those modernist tropes were. But fabulous artists as well, like Louise Lawler or Sherry Levine, or there was also kind of a feminism to some of it. It was quite an interesting project. Also, people, maybe you could even say somebody like Robert Balla, maybe in that early work. A lot of that kind of absorbing and thinking through a kind of a sense of modernity, excitement with it, but also a questioning of it. And there's certain jokiness, maybe somebody like Rita Duffy as well. I,
And
yeah.
okay, and so you were saying that kind of a body of work that is, I guess, ongoing is this idea of questioning the Irish identity. And like obviously you're joining us here this evening in your capacity as director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art. And I wonder if you might, paint a picture of some of the key milestones and just kind of give us the context of what life so far has looked like for the museum.
You mean since its inception in 91? Yeah, I'd
Exactly.
love to. I mean, it's one of the big reasons I came back. I think it's a very exciting model. I mean, obviously the founding, we apparently have Charlie Hoy to thank for spearheading the kind of idea of a role for a museum of modern and contemporary art. There were several big internationalist projects called Rusk in the 80s, which I think, lots of very interesting organizers sort of arranged to start to think about how we could show what was understood as modern art and postmodern art maybe at that time in the 80s. There was a huge appreciation of the dynamism of all of that. And so the Irish Museum of Modern Art was established in 91, and its first director was Declan McGonigal. Now, is an extremely interesting person. He was the only curator, as I understand it, to ever be nominated for the Turner Prize
Wow.
as a curator. His practice was considered to be extremely creative, and he began his work in Derry, in the north of Ireland, and was very innovative of bringing in different practices, big international practices, and specifically looking at the location of Derry, obviously at the height of the Troubles, all of that, but very, very innovative. So, a fantastic person to take this on. I think, I don't know, I think he had a very intelligent and questioning approach indeed to that idea of what kind of museum did we want or deserve, or what could we do. I think he was very influenced by a lot of the very interesting movements in America at that time around radical new museums. A specific one that's often quoted is the New Museum in New York, which rather famously didn't really aspire to have a collection as such, but really wanted to be a social power plant, really wanted to think the civic, privileged community work and education massively. And so he created an extremely dynamic model, knowing all of those kind of thoughts that were happening in the 90s around what a contemporary museum would be. And so he really started that. And already at the beginning, I think before there was a head of collection, there was a head of education who's still with us, luckily enough, Helen O'Donoghue. Um, and they created incredibly radical programming. One of the most famously quoted programs is Once is Too Much, which was a big exhibition looking at domestic violence and working with victims of domestic violence, and developing work that actually toured the country. There was also the idea of the National Project, which was a program that brought pieces from the collection to all kinds of different spaces in Ireland from the 90s on, whether it was the library or different public spaces. And I would say was a huge catalyst for an awful lot of the fantastic regional art spaces that there are now.
Okay.
So it was a very deliberate, very politicized, very aware program. And then the second director was Enrico Juncosa, who came, I think he had been the deputy director in the Reina Sofia in Spain, so brought a huge knowledge of Latin America, of Spain itself, of course, and really invested in the collection at a time when IMMA was, of course, and the economy was very wealthy. So a very interesting curator who served 2 terms. And then we had the rather wonderful Sarah Glennie, who's very much, I would say, a colleague, but also somebody who grew up in the same sort of era as me. And in fact, I worked in the Douglas Hyde Gallery many years ago, and she had just started in IMMA, so it's quite interesting. And so she took over then, and I think, she's a very interesting institutional thinker. and was bringing IMMA out of, lots of challenges in relation to the recession. Also dealt with the whole renovation of the site. They moved to Earlsford Terrace at a particular period, created very innovative corporate sponsorships and a very active residency program that really serviced Irish artists. And I should say the residency program was very important always, that we had a making at the heart of IMMA. Yeah, so they're the three, and then we had a wonderful interim director who actually was very special. His name was Moling Ryan, just before I came, and he came from a very different background. I think he was the chair of legal aid and various other things. He was asked by the government to come in and step in at a particular moment, just in the gap. And but I learned an awful lot from him. I used to joke that he was like the Robert Mueller of the Irish art, sort of governmental scene. He was just a very deliberate and smart thinker about institutional life. And he really just brought in lots of really good corporate governance and just really galvanized a lot of really interesting thinking. Sometimes it's wonderful to have a voice from outside to kind of look at the state of everything. So I kind of stepped in after him, and and he and Sarah, all of them, and left me a wonderful legacy.
Okay, it's lovely to see the evolution of an institution through, its protectors ultimately. I never knew the Haughey connection, so that's interesting
Yeah.
in of itself. And one thing that I think about often when visiting museums and cultural institutions is the spaces that they're housed within. And I'm sure in some instances it's deliberate, in others it's circumstantial to what's possible. But I, your location in the Royal Hospital, like, do you think that's really instrumental to IMMA, or how do you perceive the venue?
I do. I remember at one point, one of my very innovative, out of the box thinkers on the board was saying, well, maybe you should move to somewhere like the GPO. I was like, oh, wow, okay.
Okay.
I don't quite know how we get the GPO out of the GPO, but so anyway, I feel like it's married to that place just because it's been there. I suppose what apparently when it started, there was thoughts about it being on the docks, actually. That was one idea originally. I think in relation to not only the way Declan was thinking and formulating ideas of the Irish contemporary, somehow, I think IMMA is a fascinating place. Of course, it's really difficult environmentally and on lots of levels to mobilize around a very complex old building like this, but I love the history, and I think one of the things I really want to do relatively soon is try and develop quite a big multidisciplinary conference around the material culture of the site. I mean, when you start to think about what's on that site, it's quite incredible. There's one of the earliest high crosses in Ireland, in the graveyards. There's obviously Bully's Acre. This incredible sort of colonial building, sort of imperial building, in fact, an incredible story of war and of trauma, not only necessarily in relation to British rule, but also all those soldiers who were recuperating there, who had seen many different military sort of exercises. So it's incredible. And then there's 30 years of commissioned artworks and site-specific programming. So I think museums are the memory of much more than just it's kind of visual art practice. And I would love to take a key from that. I do think IMMA has been remarkably successful as a contemporary art museum, but I would like to see more crossover between the two. When I came first, one of the people on the visual education team said, well, we have a white cube, which is the classic term for a museum or certainly an art space. And we have a green cube. And I thought that was really beautiful, that idea that, we have 48 acres to work with. So we're sort of, the OPW are also the custodians in a way. So there's there's that relationship to negotiate too, but I mean, they run the building really beautifully. So I think many artists find it super exciting. There used to be an idea that we were indeed engaged with white cubes, which were utterly neutral, autonomous spaces. But I think we all understand the nonsense of that. It was a nice aspiration. It was a very modernist aspiration, but actually every space is loaded and filled with ideology and and circumstance. So we just have to have we happen to have a very particular one. So I'm excited by that, and I think it's it gives us plenty of context from which to work.
Absolutely, and I think I dare say that green cube is becoming all more relevant in this particular time we're finding ourselves living through.
Absolutely.
And so, like you took on your role with IMMA in March 2019, if I remember correctly, and obviously had a full year of your initial workings before 2020 and the pandemic kicked in. I kind of to ask you two questions in one. I wonder, where your priorities were and what your goals were when you started, and then leading that into how did the first full year go, bring you up to March of this year?
Great question. In fact, I only started part-time at that moment. I continued, would you believe, working in the Netherlands too, sucker for punishment. But I
A
was
busy schedule.
developing a very big exhibition with the Otolith Group, who are an extraordinary group of filmmakers, and it's a show that's touring right now. It's kind of going all over the world, and it will come to IMMA too. And they're really exciting artists who think about the notion of the Black avant-garde, so often through music, through film, through world cinema, it's a very, very serious and very exciting intellectual and artistic project, I think. So it's their
Mm.
first ever retrospective. So I kind of wanted to see that through. But I think in my first year, everybody tells you all kinds of different things. Don't do anything. Do change everything. And I was very interested to kind of I was very impressed by the team anyway, very interested in simply letting them do what they do. We had the fantastic Dora Salcedo show, was one of the first things I kind of officially opened. We had, Sean Kassan worked on this incredible Derek Jarman retrospective. And again, it's one of the first. So I wanted to see how it operated, what was happening. I would say my intentions are haven't really changed, and in fact, even the craziness of COVID has possibly escalated the possibility around some things. So there was a few things I wanted to do. I really wanted to look at the imbalances I felt there was between temporary exhibitions and a kind of serious interrogation of the collection. Sorry, the collection is very interesting, and it was exposed for sure, and and exhibited, but often I felt it could be interesting, and these are a lot of the experiments that I had sort of developed with the Abbe Museum, not necessarily consciously playing with this idea of us being a time machine, like literally naming that and understanding the processes around that when we collect, what we brand, what we include, what we exclude. So that was something I thought and I knew we were coming up to our 30th anniversary next year. So my sense was I really wanted to escalate a lot of thinking and activity around the acquisitions.
Mm.
And the other thing was I thought, and again, these are things that have been in my mind for a long time. There's something really neoliberal about always producing the new, and museums actually can take a stand against that. They can look at history, they can engage on other levels too. So I was very interested in maybe slowing down that crazy exhibition machine, and just through lots of discussions with people, knowing that when they came up to IMMA, there was often a sense that, oh, I've missed that show, or, and there wasn't a dramatic enough expose of the collection, I thought, for people to kind of return to it over a longer period. So I started to toy with the idea that maybe we keep sort of collections up for 2 to 3 years, actually, in the very classic, almost conservative way that museums, one expects a permanent exhibition, and a sort of permanent exhibition of the collection, and then maybe changing shows. So I was definitely interested in that, and I think just because it's a structure that's very transparent, and perhaps it's very historical, doesn't mean that what you show can't be very radical and very challenging. So that's a little bit where I was trying to flip the thinking a bit. And I was very clear that I thought that the departments themselves were quite siloed, and very brilliant people in them, but there was very much you were in collection or you were in temporary exhibitions or your engagement and learning. So I really wanted to see if we could mix that up a bit and we could actually kind of co-curate shows in a different way. So there was those ideas. The other big, and so to that end, I decided that no matter what, we were going to do a huge collection show to celebrate the anniversary. And we're still doing that. It's just endlessly getting postponed as we can't get into the building at the moment, but that will happen. And so that was, you know, so those plans didn't really change, I think, within COVID. They certainly just got a bit delayed. And then the other one, which has got delayed, but I still am very determined to do, is to put kind of Irish visual art practice on a bigger global map. I kind of don't think that we're visible enough, and that's from 25 years sort of very much engaged in visual art practice in Europe and making biennials and seeing kind of what's going on. The presence of visual art is improving, but we're much better at it in theatre and in literature and in film. But we haven't really mobilized a very clear strategy. So I was quite interested in seeing whether our residency program could start to be kind of a hub around that, that we would really bring in a lot more contemporary curators to visit and engage with Irish practice. Simply knowing how good Irish practice is and realizing that there's not much opportunity, you know, for international galleries and all that stuff. So if we could simply create more bigger and more sort of fluid networks around the possibility of work going out there, I think there's a huge hunger for it. I think certainly from my sense of what I was seeing in Europe and abroad, I think it was a pity that it was missing.
And I think it's interesting though, as you said, the fact that your own personal experience working internationally for so many years means that you are perfectly placed to be actually seeing it from the two sides and the two perspectives. So
Well,
it's really
hopefully. I guess that's why they gave me the job. Yeah, no, and I love that. I mean, I value that hugely, you know. So, I mean, for me, it's like coming back to Ireland and understanding, you know, all the incredible developments here has been, you know, a big learning curve. But it's great. So it's a bit about trying to keep those two parts in play.
Yeah, well, it's I think as an attendee, it'll be interesting to see what the next few years look like. And like as you alluded to there, you kind of mentioned the fact that your team aren't currently in ready access to the building, because obviously in level 5 we're all closed at the moment. But I remember back in March when the kind of the I guess the initial conversations and communications around the pandemic were really starting. Imma, you had quite an unusual role to play in the pandemic that I guess all other institutions, cultural institutions, didn't. Like we obviously saw in the media that your site was being turned into a temporary morgue facility. Like, surely that's not in the job description when you apply for the director of a cultural institution.
Surely not, one would have thought. It definitely wasn't in the small print. No, it was fascinating actually. I had no idea that actually Imma's site, the RHK site, has always been designated within the Irish National Project as an emergency mortuary.
Okay.
Possibly the size of it and the, you know, and its relative proximity to the city and all of those things. So I simply didn't know that. But it was a fascinating moment. It's quite interesting. I was just having a conversation a few weeks ago with CIMAM, which is an international museum network, and you know, art spaces in Belgium were sort of saying, gosh, you know, it's only now in the second wave that we kind of didn't really transform our practice in the first wave, but it is now, because I mean, of course, the numbers are kind of slightly horrifying in poor Belgium right now. But for us, you know, indeed, transformation was unavoidable. It was a zero-sum game. We were simply closed down. And it was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary moment. But in a way, you know, I mean, we all remember it. Of course, it was March 12th, right, when they announced the lockdown, and it was pretty soon after that they, you know, we started working on the idea. And my staff, I mean, the operations people were amazing and really helped develop the construction of the morgue and everything very quickly with Dublin City Council and with the government. And of course, we were all on message in a very particular way because it was understood as this kind of national emergency. So on one level, it was kind of amazing because, you know, we were all seeing those horrifying pictures of refrigerated morgues parked outside hospitals in New York and in Italy, and you know, it was just the creeping horror of the whole thing. So on one level, it did feel like this is a beautiful site, you know. It has dealt with its fair share of trauma in the past, and it could do this, you know. So I think that's what we simply tried to do, was to just understand that and think about how we could help. Um, so that's pretty much how we engaged, and then we then started to think simply about what we could do offsite, and that, you know, and again looking at how lucky we are on some levels in comparison to, if you look at the MoMA and Tate and all of these places that are furloughing workers, and you know, we managed to keep everybody on board, touch wood and everything, but you know, and then it was a chance to push that idea of cross-functional working. So the thing I'd wanted to do anyway, suddenly we could do, because everybody was at home. Everybody, you know, we were trying to get everybody computers and sort all that out. But suddenly we thought, wow, you know, this is the moment to think about a horizon line for all of us using all those skills. So the visual education team, who are of course always on the front line and talking to the public, had no public. So they started to audit the website and produce other kind of content and develop our Alzheimer's and cocooning kind of for older people, sort of content for that. And they were amazing. I mean, they completely just engaged. And we set up several sort of editorial groups, one to look at commemoration. As we know, we're all in that big process of developing ideas around commemoration in this decade of commemoration. So that was great. It was suddenly bringing different kind of thinking people, practices together. We developed another idea about site development. What would the site look like if we ever opened again? And one on acquisition policy, the way I wanted to put collecting front and center in a very assertive way, in a less passive way, where we were just accepting donations, or it's really trying to look, okay, what have we actually got? What does it mean? What's the intellectual backbone of this collection? So, and then a digital program, because as we understood, all of us suddenly had to, transform our activity into the digital sphere. So that was how we worked. We sort of worked from our various bedrooms and offices like everybody else. But we felt like we had kind of good long-term horizon lines, which luckily, I think if I had been there a little less, it would have been harder to figure that out. But I think at least having that run in of a year, allowed us to get going.
I guess at least you knew people on a first name basis at that stage. That would have
Exactly. I understood all the acronyms for everything as well.
I see that my colleague Trevor is here with us tonight, and
Happy
Trevor just
travel.
typed in saying, Annie, we're lucky to have you here in Dublin and can't wait to see what you have planned for next year.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.
So if anyone has questions, I see a couple of people have their hands up. Please do type in the questions that you have for Annie, and we'll be delighted to go through them. But you know, kind of just going back to actually kind of what Trevor was mentioning there, like when you and I were speaking the other day, you were saying that you're spending time looking at, you know, what your programming and residencies might look like in a 2020, 2021 context, and
Mm.
that little green box might be becoming more relevant. Am I correct in thinking that?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, again, one of the things that was amazing, you know, I mean, in my worst nightmare, of course, the idea was that this specter of the morgue would just hang over IMMA forever, you know, but it was so fantastic that it didn't, that people really were delighted when the grounds opened again. Of course, the local community, because it's really quite a significant green space and quite a built up area, of course, around Kilmainham and Inchicore and Houston Quarter. But that was great, you know, on some levels it's very transformative to realize when everything's gone, like what is the most valuable. And secondly, then we start to think, okay, the grounds are a place that not only give people respite, but people are scared. I certainly had no appetite to go into a cafe or a building necessarily either, you know, so it was just trying to understand all of that. So our site development team and the visual education team really started to develop what we call the People's Pavilion. And we did our social circles. We'd seen great examples from San Francisco and other places. So we were just trying to think, okay, how can we actually manage people where it gives them a sense of safety? And we start to just activate the grounds over the summer, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was you know, I mean, obviously sometimes we got rained out of it, but it was great activities. We had performances, but we had also yoga classes, painting. We had botanical tours, again looking at this kind of idea of the green cube. Um, and we opened up just a very simple open air cafe on the grounds. So it just it actually unleashed a whole energy around the site, I think, because people were relieved to come back, but also lots of new visitors. It was really interesting, um, um, just to see what that did. And so that my idea of flipping from only focusing on temporary exhibitions, you know, started to play out on the grounds in quite a different way. And so next year, I actually think, I mean, you know, in my worst sort of days, and maybe Trevor can speak to this too, I think we're going to be flipping between level 5 and level 3, you know, right up until April. I don't know. And if museums don't open, it's really tough. And there's lots of reasons why they could. I would say if we can manage, you know, because we manage, I think the creativity and the capacity and the professionalism of the art scene has been amazing. You know, really trying to understand how to galvanize and to organize, and to do things safely. So I'm really hoping that either we go down to level 2 or they allow us in level 3 to open all the museums. I think there's a lot of interest in that now, and just for people's mental health as well. So knowing that, I probably am going to continue with the success of the People's Pavilion and maybe think about 3 or 4 pavilions right from next March through to October. So I'm kind of, we're really shifting things. You know, we were going to have our anniversary year. We still will do this big collection show, but I'm actually suggesting that we split the budget between outdoor and indoor much more radically than we would have ever done before. And actually program sort of artistic practice on the site. And the residencies, we're looking at opening those out for open submissions, just to try and help out the local community. So even if I wanted to have a global program, I think we'll wait a year or two with that. So I think we're going to try and launch that relatively soon. And then I'm also going to see if those artists might be people who would be willing to contribute to the programming on the site. So people who are engaged with kind of more interactive practice or outdoor practice or public practice, so that we create a kind of a sense of dynamism and community on the site, in a way that we didn't necessarily do very consistently before. We really were very, I think we were very caring of our artistic community, but we really let them do whatever they wanted to do. And now I'm thinking, well, maybe they could help us just also activate the site in a particular way. So they're all kind of big new sort of experiments. I just saw a nice ad in one of the art magazines the other day for the Queen's Museum in New York, which is a great museum. And they're calling it sort of the year of great uncertainty. And they're also reactivating, and a lot of museums are there. They're activating their residencies and their facilities for the local scene next year and this year, I think, because you know, bringing in global exhibitions and all of the problems with transport and trying to install shows are just making things very, very complicated.
Yeah, I think it's also the opportunity to be, as you were alluding to there, kind of to support our local environments at this
Yeah.
particular moment is definitely a key one. It's I remember actually spotting on Twitter the other day Simon O'Connor, the director of Molly, who's a former colleague of ours in the Little Museum. I remember seeing him refer to museums as the indoor playground. And I remember thinking that was a particularly beautiful way of putting it. And
Yeah, absolutely.
as you said, here's hoping that we do find a way collectively and with the government to open in level 3 if that's where we remain, because as you said, like, we collectively have incredible teams that are really have been beyond amazing over the past couple of months.
Yeah, and given the weather, you know, we can't. I mean, we can try and be a bit more Scandinavian and dress for the rain and all the rest, but I think it would be great if we could, yeah, provide space for people.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. It's and the this focus on like the residency programs that you're running. I'd love to know just a little bit more about you know, the vision and the mission for the residencies as you describe them, or I don't know if that's been announced yet in terms of the coming year or two.
Well, I'm interested. There's a few sort of thematics or ideas that we're looking at. One is the idea of radical inclusion. So it's taking the 30 years of how IMMA has been really focused on being a kind of a connector, sort of engaged with an idea of social justice and politics, actually, right from Declan's period. And I think I love that. And I think that's really interesting because it sort of brings us back to the idea of not being autonomous and not being sort of a cathedral for art, but rather a social power plant, a civic center in the classic sense. And I'm interested in that. I think that's actually, we're realizing that the blockbuster model, look at Tate losing money hand over fist, all of those, we're nimble, we're small, and we're much more engaged with our communities here. And I think that's great. So that idea of radical inclusion is going to be quite important, but also in our exhibition program and in various ways. And then the other, what I was interested in with the residency, but also with the collections, is this idea of being a global connector. So what I did find, if I am allowed to be a little bit critical, but I feel bad maybe saying this, but I was quite surprised at how completely embedded we are in the sort of Anglo sphere in relation to how we historicize Irish art practice still. That did surprise me quite a lot, that there was a real sense of embodying it in a kind of narrative that is either very American or British in a way. And given the huge global changes that have happened. So I'm very, very interested in trying to understand that. I mean, one very simple idea is us looking at commemoration and trying to understand that idea of 1921 as being a moment of self-determination for lots of small nations, and really trying to use that moment of creating sort of comparatives, in sort of dialogical comparatives with other places, rather than always in the kind of assumed cultural traffic in which we kind of posit ourselves. So I'm fascinated to understand all of the places from Turkey, which was no longer the Ottoman Empire, to Austria and Hungary, which were no longer the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to all of the sort of Latvia, Lithuania, all of those post First World War emerging states, and what were the dialogues around those things, and how would we understand artistic practice in relation to what people were announcing? I mean, there was one famous idea that Yugoslavia was actually articulated as a state in the form of an exhibition before the states were ever made. The artists had come together and named themselves. So there's lots of wonderful examples about how artists imagined kind of, it could be democracy or just how we live together. And I think I'd like us to be in those dialogues a little bit, and as a way to start thinking that globality now as well. So for me, the residency is one way of doing that a little bit more. Like I said, I've also invited a group of kind of international experts to help us develop our acquisition policy. I found our acquisition policy, but actually a lot of them are extremely technocratic documents that are really quite boring. And I'd like to assert what are the values, and so that if I hand it over to an international expert, I can say, well, what would you suggest reading, what we stand for? So I think it's creating this kind of fluidity of possibility of dialogue, I think, around our practices here and where we find comparatives. I mean, one of the things I always think that's so disappointing when we discuss modernity is the idea that we're not really looking at the experience of Irish modernity in relation to Catholic theocracies like Spain or Portugal or, Latin America. That's a modernist story that we haven't rehearsed yet. What does that mean aesthetically? What does that mean on so many levels culturally? So there's so many things to do.
You won't. I don't think you'll be finding yourself bored anytime soon. Let's put it that
No,
way.
I don't think so.
And you mentioned kind of, I guess, ultimately being an openness to being quite political in the work that you're doing, and I kind of, it's something that we talk about in the museum, little museum, from time to time, in terms of where our role is in certain conversations, and like, do you think that contemporary art and modern art museums actually have a role to play when we're talking about, if we look at some of the key issues affecting our time, be it pandemic, climate emergency, the Black Lives Matter movement, is there a voice and a role that organizations such as IMMA should be playing in those conversations?
It's a great question. You know, there's a few very interesting thinkers on this at the moment. You could kind of rehearse so many different ideas. Simon Sheikh, who's a very good thinker, and Tirdad Zolgadar, who's a sort of I think he's originally Palestinian thinker. He's based in Germany now, in Berlin. He talks about the idea that the contemporary art world embraced the language of politics, while, you know, whitewashing the oligarchs' money, you know. So there's a real sense that we need to be very careful what we mean by political. There was a certain fashionability and superficiality about our sense of the political in the way in which we talked and named things over the last 30 to 40 years. What's very significant and what complicates the idea of the political is the idea of the art market, because the art market just exploded in the 2000s, which meant suddenly that there was a reinvestment in the idea of the discrete art object, and all of that work that had been done, you know, right from Malevich and Lazitsky on, you know, in understanding and thinking about how to apply artistic practice to the world, kind of retreated in relation to. It was very hard to compete against that kind of the force of the art market. When it started to explode. So there's a real interesting tension there between the notion of what is the political. And then the other thing to understand is not only are we history making machines as museums, we're also products of colonialism. You know, modernity, whose dark side is colonialism. Even if Ireland, of course, isn't necessarily engaged in the it has adopted the institutions of modernity, put it that way. And museums inherently can be seen as wonderful places, but also violent places that wrest things out of a kind of other cultural significance and brand them or suggest that they are elite or important. So it's always a question of balancing. The real political moment for me is deciding what stays in and what do we exclude, you know, and it's an understanding that exclusion is a kind of epistemological violence.
Mm.
So they're all, you know, it's wrought with politics no matter what, just by opening the doors in the morning. So I think that's fascinating, and it's but I think it's very important to understand that and not be defensive about it, but rather think, okay, then how do we mobilize this, knowing what we know? So yeah, I think if we think about ideas of, you know, that the violence, the epistemological violence of the museum, then things like radical inclusion become very important because they allow for another kind of dialogue or mediate in a very sophisticated way between kind of opposing political forces. So there's lots of possibility with the museum on that level.
And when you use the phrase radical inclusion, which is a brilliantly vivid phrase, like what does that mean to IMMA?
We'll find out. I think for me, it's radical can mean many things, right? Of course, it can mean, you know, feeling radical is sort of sometimes people think of it as quite essentializing, but it also means the radius, like the carrot with the roots. So it's kind of a root and branch kind of change. I mean, I thought about a lot of this in my last museum. We sort of also thought about inclusion on different levels, and I think it's goes back to this wonderful idea of Derrida, who said at one point, why don't we think about the idea of what would happen if we just say yes instead of no? And of course, you know, that's fraught with complexity, but imagine as a thought exercise to think about the ideas of saying yes instead of no. And that's where you start to think about ideas of the gatekeeping that curators do around particular practice. So even me trying to flip around the departments together and seeing what would the surplus value of that be, because we can, and it's a tricky one because it's not to say that you're not interested in expertise and precision, but you're also interested in somehow allowing for that to be questioned. So, I mean, on the most simple level, my visual education team are, to all intents and purposes, kind of curators at the moment. They're curating and organizing on the grounds in a way that I don't think, you know, because of the gatekeeping that might have been possible before. So that's one form of inclusivity. It's also saying that if other people want to sell, part of the People's Pavilion was other people organizing on the grounds instead of us. So again, trying to open the doors and share the resources. And that's everybody from the Abbey to smaller artistic groups who would take over the People's Pavilion for their own curatorial work or artistic work. So it's there's no fixed answer. I suppose it's a set of intentions. The other thing I'd love to do is make the whole dialogue around what IMMA could do much more interdisciplinary. I think it's very focused on fine art, on visual art, and I would love if the residency could be there for scientists and art writers and all kinds of other disciplines too, because I just think that's so productive. But it's like those things are only possible when you have a precision to what you do. So it'll take us a while to figure out.
But I think the one thing that sounds really exciting in kind of all the different elements that you're kind of marrying there is that the role of the audience member, the role of the visitor seems to be integral to each of those conversations, and each of them are feeding into ways to ultimately enhance the way that guests can interact with the, I guess, the grounds as well as the museum, which is exciting. And it's like, I know I was reading about when we're talking about kind of audience access and participation, I was reading about a project that you guys are involved in called Azure, which is you might tell everyone about that. I think it's an amazing initiative.
Yeah, it's very, very beautiful. And again, comes from that engagement and learning sort of history and thinking. It's a project, we managed to secure the funding to have a new curator of art and aging. So already that is interesting, kind of really trying to think about, what is a huge percentage of our community, our population is a community of age. Obviously specifically vulnerable now because of all the cocooning and the isolation. I mean, we all have hundreds of stories, of course. There's something very beautiful. I mean, again, and this was all in train to be developed before I came to IMMA, but we had also developed similar projects at the Van Abbe, where I worked around ideas of working with aphasia, blindness and partially sighted people, and definitely Alzheimer's. And there's something incredible about understanding not only that the museum is a place where you can be in a slow time and not an everyday time, a kind of crazy time, that the behaviors and the architectures are there for kind of a contemplation and a slowness and a deliberation that's just very unique, and especially in this speeded up world is quite precious. So what if we lean into that? And then with things like Alzheimer's, I think it's so fascinating, because working with, often we invite families living with dementia. So not only the person who has it, but maybe the people who are living with them and dealing with it, to look at artworks, to have slow looking at artworks. And what's extraordinary is it's probably like with music and with many other fantastic sort of possibilities, it triggers a different conversation that isn't a corrective conversation where you're reminding people of what they haven't said or what they've got wrong, or you're trying, like, it's an incredibly focused moment just looking at what's in front of us and the association. So and the experience can often be beyond language, and that's what's so valuable. So I think a lot of people are realizing that museums have massive potential in relation to all of this. We've understood this, but often, curators used to dismiss all this stuff as art therapy or community art or all these things, whereas actually now we're beginning to understand that this is a huge part of our role. So, and it unleashes so much. There's another really good thinker called Stephen Wright who discusses the idea of usership instead of ownership or participation. And I think the idea of thinking of the people who come to the museum, that it's theirs and they can use it. And they can also leave it behind and whatever, but it's a different dynamic then, and I think that's interesting. One can use it for contemplation of beauty, but one can also use it for other kinds of experiences.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think we have in the little museum, because our collection has been curated by public donation within such recent times, we get these really fascinating conversations with donors who, you know, they have as equal sense of ownership over the place as I do, and it can lead to some truly wonderful conversations. But it's an amazing thing to hear about the scale of the kind of the inclusion and kind of access initiatives that you're running. Like, I know that's very much kind of a goal for us over the next kind of 12 to 18 months as we enter into our 10th year. So I would say be pre-warned, I'll be asking your advice.
No, I love it. I mean, we should share these resources and these ideas and these skills that we're all developing. I mean, it's always through collaboration. And now, of course, what we're trying to do is both produce materials that can be posted out to people if they're not digitally savvy, and or do things online. So we're just trying to understand how to reach out in COVID as well. Yeah.
That's wonderful. It's and something that you've referenced once or twice over the course of the evening is you spent nearly 10 years working as the chief curator in the Van Abbe Museum, and I'd love you just to introduce it to those of us who are on the call this evening. Tell us a little bit about the museum and about some of your memories of your time there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the Van Abbe is really interesting. It was established in 1936. So it was actually after the MoMA and Łódź in Poland. It was one of the first purpose-built museums for modern art, as it was known at that time. An extremely beautiful building. And Eindhoven was a funny place at that point. So many people maybe fly in because Ryanair, if you're going to the Netherlands, goes into Eindhoven. So it's a city about the size of Cork. It's quite wealthy. It used to be Philips factory. All of Philips were there. It was a very paternalistic town in that it sort of educated the workers. It sent their kids to college. PSV, which is the famous football team, is actually Philips Sociale Vereniging. It's the Philips Social Club. That's what the acronym is. So it's interesting to see the legacies of such a big sort of industrial town. All of that gone now, of course, but so there was a wealth from that. There was also kind of a colonial wealth from tobacco coming in via Antwerp. And what's fascinating about Eindhoven is it's just on the nexus between Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands. So of course, as an Irish person, it's always glorious to drive across borders with such ease. You know, it never stopped to fascinate me after even 25 years there. And it was in an interesting position when it started, because it was somehow, if you think about how the old art world was, you know, in maybe the first half of the 20th century, obviously there was Paris, New York was emerging. Cologne became incredibly important while there was still the Iron Curtain before Berlin took over. And so Eindhoven actually sat in a really and Belgium was a very important place for collecting as well. So somehow Eindhoven became this wonderful way through for many people who were art lovers and engaged with artistic practice. There were 5 directors, all men, but some very, very interesting ones. Jan Hut was quite famous for developing what was called a project called The Street, which was really thinking about the idea of material culture, actually, and mixing it up with art. Actually, all of the first directors were just, the Netherlands was very famous for museum experimentation. So many of them started there, then they went to The Hague, and then they would eventually end up in the Stedelijk when the art world was very small. So Van Abbe was always considered this real jewel in the crown in terms of its kind of resources and its collection, and as a kind of very it was always understood to be a very experimental space. Its collection would have been very interesting. And Jan Lering, that guy I was telling you about, he collected a lot of Russian avant-garde practice. So it's kind of what, and allied that with the idea of de style, which was also looking at abstraction and design. So that was just fantastic collection, wonderful Picassos, Chagall, Mondrian, and very solid, kind of probably also very based in the Anglosphere. I think it had the first ever Bruce Nauman show, first ever conceptual and minimalist shows in Europe. So it was a trailblazer in a particular way. Has a big conceptual art collection, big minimalist art collection, then went to LA, sort of bought a lot of the kind of LA scene in the 90s, like Mike Kelly and Paul McCarthy and all those kind of people. So it's got an excellent collection. And then the director who came in, who I worked with, was Charles Escher, and he was known for really embracing an awful lot of the thinking and practices around the expanded Eastern Europe. So we've got a really excellent collection emerging from the 90s on, with Willem Sasnaal, Nedko Sologov, a lot of the greats from that particular period. So that before that, I was an independent curator, sort of loving running around and thinking about peripheral projects all over the place. And I'd set up this thing called If I Can't Dance with two other curators, which was looking at performance practice. But it was only when I was excited by his experiments and his valuing the collection and thinking of, what it meant in its idiosyncratic kind of whole. And he invited me to become director, but I actually met him in Cork. I knew him a little bit in the Netherlands, but he and I co-curated a project for the City of Culture of Cork in 2005 called Cork Caucus. So that was the first time we worked together, and it was really, really exciting. It was an amazing project. It was in the National Sculpture Factory, and it was with another team of curators. Art Not Art were their names. And as a wonderful publication as well. And at that moment, we were trying to look at the idea of what was the city of Cork in relation to the planetary. And we had some incredible speakers from all over the world. And it was interesting. So I understood him to be quite experimental. And I understood the legacy of this space to be quite experimental too. So that began a kind of trajectory of 10 years of working. And he invited me originally to develop a kind of Cork Caucus project in the Van Abbe, which we called Becoming Dutch. And we were trying to look at the idea of the kind of increasing essentialization of nationalism in Europe at that time. And so it was quite it was a huge project. It was almost like a biennial in scale, a lot of commissions and a big sort of 4-week summer school. It was kind of an incredible exploration over a 2-year period. So that was my beginnings there. And then, I worked my way up, I think, from a freelancer into do a project to becoming the chief curator. So, so I embraced all of that. I mean, the kind of keywords there were things like, in fact, radicality, experimentality, and hospitality. And more recently, one of the terms that we coined before I left was I think I'm trying to think of all of them. I think there was inclusion, indeed, but deviance, which I thought was rather beautiful. So in a way, it was a great space because of its provincialness. In a way, we were slightly off the radar in relation to the kind of obligations of the national or the capital city, and we were funded well enough to kind of really experiment. So I think so it was a very joyful, rambunctious 10 years.
They are a beautiful combination of words. That definitely sounds. If you could summarize an experience in a few words, that's gorgeous. And I guess we're coming up on the hour, which is hard to believe. But I guess in terms of, I think a lot of my conversations that I'm having with friends and family at the moment are around this idea of hope and the future and what we're looking forward to, and trying to very consciously articulate that. And I guess I'd love to ask you to give me something to look forward to within your programming and ambitions for the next few years. What are you excited and looking forward to?
Good question. I'm really excited to have more people, more users on the site. I'm really excited to see what that will be. I loved the collaboration with the Abbey. And I think more of that, more of other fantastic kind of cultural institutions and disciplines up to IMMA would be great. I think I'm excited. I mean, we did this really big experiment that it was open for like 2 weeks before the last lockdown, which will extend now, called Ghosts of the Recent Past. And it's our first pilot around the collection. So I'm kind of really excited to work with the whole team on pulling together this new big show, which will be in all of the exhibition spaces next year. It'll probably, hopefully, open in September. And we managed to get this money. We managed to lobby the department for acquisition funds. So we, for the first time in years, have got €500,000 to buy artworks. So that's a huge injection into that dialogue.
Congratulations.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting, and it's a real shot in the arm for the institution on many levels. I'm hopeful because I think it's just good, the mad thing about being the morgue is we had nothing left to lose.
That's
So it's just, I'm
liberating.
just excited to kind of get everything mobilized. And I think, I mean, I know people come up with all these trite kind of discussions about the future, but I expect there to be a huge unleashing of energy and creativity. People are talking about the idea that this is a great reset, and it is in a way. I mean, the reason I lobbied so hard for acquisition money is I think there's something so perverse about us pushing production all the time. There are other ways for us to engage and be together and think, rather than forcing kind of reactive production in a pandemic. So,
Mhm.
this is it's, some of us have never been busier, but on another level, this opportunity to kind of reset and to understand that maybe our global travel and all of our mad speed wasn't good for us. So I'm excited to imagine that there'll be new visual languages, new creativity, and new energy unleashed after all this. So yeah, hopefully we can show some of it up at IMMA.
And as you enter into a new decade and a new zero, hopefully 30
Yes,
will start
exactly.
a new event and a new period. Well, Annie, this has been it's been really fascinating. I've so thoroughly enjoyed talking to you this evening, and thank you so much for being so generous with your stories and your knowledge. And I really, you've put the longing on me to get back up into yourselves for a visit once I'm
Great. Well, please
allowed
come. You're
inside.
welcome. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And to everyone who joined us this evening, thank you all for being here for another episode of 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. We'll see you all next week. But just for now, Annie, sincerely, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.